The sound of splintering wood echoed through the valley like thunder. My hands tightened into fists as I watched the bridge collapse, piece by piece, into the waters below. That bridge wasn't just planks of wood to MIT, was the only link to my family's land. The same bridge my grandfather had built with his own hands half a century ago. And now it was gone, not by accident, not by nature, but by the order of the HOA board that had been trying to push me out for years. They stood on the other side, smug faces staring at me, acting like they'd won. They thought tearing down my bridge would force me to sell, would humiliate me into submission. What they didn't realize was that they'd just lit a fire inside me, hotter than any sun. My lake wasn't just water to them, it was their crown jewel. Their $2 million resort sat proudly on its shore, filled with wealthy families who paid absurd HOA fees for lakeside views, boat docks, and summer parties. They thought they owned it, but every drop of water, every ripple, still belonged to me. As I stood there, staring at the wreckage floating downstream, I made a silent promise. They were going to regret this. I knew secrets about this land they didn't know about the dam. They didn't know I held the keys to the lake itself. And when I opened those gates, every boat, every dock, every dream they built on stolen arrogance would sink into mud. The HOA wanted a war. They just didn't realize the battlefield was mine. Asterisk, the sound of breaking wood carries differently when it's something you love. It's not just noise, it's pain. I stood frozen at the water's edge, my heart pounding as the bridge I had crossed since childhood cracked in two and fell into the lake below. Planks broke apart like matchsticks, the posts ripped from the soil, and the waves swallowed it whole in less than a minute. It was deliberate, it was cruel, and it was a final straw. That bridge wasn't just wood and nails, it was family. My grandfather built it with his own hands back when he first bought the land. He used lumber, he milled himself, hammered every nail, and told me once that he built it strong enough to outlive him. For 50 years, it had stood there, connecting one side of the lake to the other. I learned to walk across it before I learned to ride a bike. My father had taken me fishing from the middle of it, holding my hand so I wouldn't fall in. My mother had stood at the end of it every evening, waving for me to come home for dinner. It wasn't just a bridge, it was part of my family's story. Now, in front of me, it was nothing but splinters floating in the water, and standing smugly on the other side of the shore was the HOA president, Karen. She had her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on her face like she'd finally won some sort of game. Around her were 3 other board members, all with that same look of arrogance. None of them said a word, but their silence spoke louder than anything. They wanted me to see this. They wanted me to hurt. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. For weeks they'd been threatening to deal with the bridge. They claimed it was unsafe, not up to code, and a liability for the community. But that bridge wasn't theirs. It was on my property, built decades before their gated community even existed. Still, the HOA had been relentless. Letters, fines, threats, none of it had moved me. I refused to take it down because I knew it wasn't just wood, it was history. And so they took matters into their own hands. I shouted across the water, my voice shaking with rage. You had no right. Karen just tilted her head slightly, like she was speaking to a child. It was dangerous, she called back. We couldn't allow it to remain. Think of the liability. Liability. I laughed bitterly. That bridge has been here longer than any of you. Nobody asked you to touch it. She shrugged. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice. Her words hit me like a slap. Progress. That was the word she always used. It wasn't progress, it was greed. The HOA wanted full control of the lake. My land stood in their way. They wanted their $1 million resort to look like a private paradise, with their docks, their boats, their luxury cabins. My bridge didn't fit the picture. To them, it was an eyesore. To me, it was my family's legacy. I felt my chest tighten as the anger built inside me. But I also felt something else, a kind of quiet fire. The kind that doesn't burn out quickly. I turned my back on them without another word and walked toward my house. Their laughter followed me across the grass like poison dot inside. The walls felt smaller than usual. My grandfather's old photographs hung by the fireplace, and for the first time, I couldn't look at them without shame. I felt like I had failed him by letting them destroy what he built. My father's old tackle box sat by the door, dusty but untouched, and I could almost hear his voice telling me not to let anyone push me around. But what could I do? The HOA had money, lawyers, and a community full of people who believed every word they said. I was one man on a piece of land that happened to hold what they wanted most. That night, I barely slept. I walked outside to the edge of the lake, staring at the empty posts sticking out of the water where the bridge used to be. The moonlight reflected off the surface, calm and still, like nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. My land wasn't safe anymore. They wouldn't stop here. They'd already fined me for unapproved modifications when I fixed up my barn. They'd tried to ban me from using the lake because I wouldn't pay their so-called membership dues. And now, they had destroyed something irreplaceable. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They wanted me gone. To them, I was a problem that needed to disappear. The next morning, I went up to the old barn, a place I hadn't spent much time in since my father passed. Dust floated in the air as I pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The smell of old hay and oil filled my nose, and for a moment, I felt like a kid again, sneaking in here to play. In the far corner was my grandfather's old chest, the one I hadn't opened in years. It was heavy, made of oak, with brass hinges that had tarnished over time. I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting it to creak like something out of a ghost story. Inside were papers, notebooks, and rolled-up maps. My grandfather had been meticulous about keeping records of the land, every repair, every project, every detail. I started flipping through them, not knowing exactly what I was looking for, but hoping to find some kind of strength in his words. That's when I found it, a yellowed blueprint, folded neatly and tucked into a leather folder. At first, I didn't recognize what I was looking at, but as I spread it out on the workbench and traced the lines with my finger, it hit me. It was the design of the dam at the far end of the property. My grandfather had built it with a small team back in the 1950s to regulate the lake's water level. He always told me the lake wasn't entirely natural, but I had never realized how much control we had over it. I stared at the blueprint for a long time, my mind racing. The dam wasn't just some old structure, it was the key to everything. The HOA might think they controlled the lake, but they didn't. I did. That night, I drove out to the dam with a flashlight. The metal gates loomed large in the dark, the sound of rushing water echoing below. The padlock on the control panel was rusty, but still strong. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key I had found in the chest. My hands shook as I slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. I didn't open it that night. Not yet. But standing there, with the roar of the lake pressing against the gates, I realized something important. They thought destroying my bridge had weakened me. They thought it had broken me. But they had no idea what they had just unleashed. The bridge was gone, but I wasn't finished. Not even close. The days after the bridge came down were some of the longest of my life. At first, I thought maybe the HOA would stop after that, satisfied that they had won. But I should have known better. The bridge wasn't their real goal, it was just another step in a campaign they had been running against me for years. Every morning, I walked down to the shore, staring at the broken posts jutting out of the water. I felt a kind of emptiness I couldn't put into words. My neighbors used to joke that the bridge was my pride, but it was more than that. It was the first thing visitors noticed, the centerpiece of the property. Without it, the lake felt incomplete, like a painting missing its frame. And the HOA knew exactly what they had done. On the third morning, I found a letter taped to my front door. Their letterhead was sharp, professional, and filled with that cold, legal language they loved to use. It stated that since the unsafe structure had been removed, the community was relieved of liability, but it also reminded me that all lake use was subject to HOA regulation. At the bottom, in bold print, they added a note: unauthorized activity on the lake will result in fines and potential legal action. I crushed the paper in my fist. Unauthorized activity. This was my land, my lake. Yet somehow, they twisted everything into their control. That same afternoon, as I walked the shoreline, I saw a group of HOA members hosting a lakeside picnic at the resort across the water. Their kids laughed, splashing in the shallows, while their parents sipped wine under big umbrellas. From where I stood, I could even hear their music. And when Karen spotted me watching, she raised her glass in a mocking toast. I turned away before the anger boiling in me spilled over every bone. In my body wanted to storm over there, but I knew I'd only end up in handcuffs. They had the money, the lawyers, the influence. But I had something better: patience and the land itself. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the old blueprint spread across the table. The dam's design was complicated, but I could see what my grandfather had built. The gates could release the water downstream, lowering the lake's level gradually or all at once if I wanted. For decades, the dam had quietly done its job, keeping the lake full and steady, giving the HOA their postcard-perfect views. And for decades, they had no idea the control sat with me. I ran my fingers across the lines of the drawing, my mind buzzing. Part of me felt guilty even considering it. Draining the lake wasn't a small thing. It would change everything. Boats would be stranded, docks would collapse, fish habitats would be ruined. But then I remembered the sight of my bridge being torn apart, the sound of Karen's laughter, the smugness of her voice when she said it was progress. That word echoed in my head like a hammer hitting steel. If progress meant destroying my history, then maybe it was time I showed them what real change looked like. The next morning I walked into town to clear my head. The hardware store owner, a man named Ray who'd known my family for years, stopped me outside. He had heard about the bridge. News traveled fast in our small community. They really tore it down, he asked. His brow furrowed. I nodded, didn't even ask, just did it. Ray cursed under his breath. That's wrong. Your grandfather built that with his bare hands. Everyone knows it. Hearing someone else acknowledge it made the anger bubble inside me again, but it also reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. People in town knew the truth, even if the HOA tried to paint me as the villain. On my way back, I passed the resort again. This time, there were construction crews working on the shore. Trucks unloaded fancy stone tiles, workers hammered stakes into the ground, and banners fluttered in the breeze announcing new expansion. Luxury lakeside dining. I stopped dead in my tracks. Expansion, they weren't just using the lake, they were building into it. My land was turning into their playground, piece by piece. Karen stood at the edge, barking orders to the workers, her red blazer bright against the water. When she saw me standing there, she walked over with that same condescending smile. "You're just in time," she said sweetly. "We're building a new boardwalk. It's going to raise property values for the entire community." "Community," I repeated, my voice tight. "You mean your pockets?" Her smile didn't waver. "You should think of it as a gift. Your land will benefit too." "My land doesn't need your boardwalk," I snapped. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped just enough for only me to hear. "Sell it to us then. You're the only holdout. Everyone else understands that this place is changing. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." I didn't answer. I just turned and walked away, fists clenched. But inside, I was already making my decision. That night I returned to the barn. I opened the chest again and pulled out the old key. It was small, iron, and heavy in my palm. I held it up to the light, my grandfather's handwriting on the blueprint, still fresh in my mind. The dam was waiting. The lake was waiting. And so was I. I drove out there under the cover of darkness. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I parked near the dam and stepped out. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. The only sound was the steady roar of water pressing against the gates. As I approached the control panel, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My hands no longer trembled like before. I placed the key into the padlock and turned it slowly. The click echoed louder than it should have in the night air. The gate shuddered as if it had been asleep for years, waiting for someone to wake it. I didn't open it fully that night. Instead, I leaned against the railing, staring down at the black water swirling below. I imagined what would happen if I pulled the lever, if the water poured out, if the lake level dropped. Their $1 million resort would become worthless overnight. Their boats would sit in mud. Their boardwalk would collapse before it was even finished. For the first time since the bridge was destroyed, I felt something like hope, not the soft, comforting kind, but a sharp, dangerous kind. The kind that comes when you realize you're holding the one card nobody else knows exists. When I finally drove home, the key rested in my pocket like a promise. I didn't know when, but I knew I would use it, not out of spite alone, but out of justice. They thought they owned me. They thought they could break me. But they forgot one thing: this land, this water, this dam. It all belonged to me, and I was done being quiet. The tension between me and the HOA thickened in the days that followed, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel their eyes on me. Some came from the resort across the lake where construction was expanding every day. Others came from my mailbox, stuffed with letters stamped in bold red ink. Violation notice, final warning, mandatory appearance. It was like they wanted to bury me under paper until I gave up. But I didn't. Not this time. Instead, I walked the property with a different perspective. Every tree, every path, every fence post, this land had history. My grandfather fought tooth and nail to keep it from developers who tried to buy him out years ago. My father worked himself to the bone to maintain it. And now, somehow, it had fallen to me to protect it against people like Karen and her board. If the bridge was their first victory, then I swore it would be their last. One afternoon, I saw Karen and 2 board members walking the shoreline near my side of the lake. They weren't on my property yet, but they were close enough that I knew what they were doing: scouting, measuring, planning. I walked over, my boots crunching on the gravel path. "You're trespassing," I called out before they even looked up. Karen turned, her smile too sweet to be sincere. "Just admiring the view," she said, glancing at the lake like it was hers. "The view isn't yours to admire," I snapped. "This is my land. Stay off it." Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened. "It's only a matter of time before you realize you're standing in the way of progress. You can't stop change." I stepped closer, close enough to see the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Maybe I can't stop change," I said slowly, "but I can sure as hell control it." She tilted her head, studying me like she was trying to figure out what I meant. I didn't give her the chance. I turned and walked away, but inside, my mind was buzzing. For the first time, I wanted her to wonder what I was capable of. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts drifting back to the dam. I pictured the gates opening, the water rushing out, the resort sinking into mud. Part of me was afraid of what that kind of destruction could bring, but another part of me, the stronger part, felt exhilarated. They had destroyed my bridge without hesitation. Why should I hesitate to show them the real power of this land? The next morning, I decided to test the waters literally. I drove to the dam before sunrise, the air still cool and heavy with mist. With the key in my pocket, I unlocked the gate and pulled the lever just slightly. The mechanism groaned, unused for decades, but it moved. A low roar began as water spilled out in a steady stream downstream. I stood there, my hands gripping the cold metal, watching the water level dip by only a few inches. To anyone else it would look like nothing, but I knew better. Even that small release would be noticed by the resort owners in a day or two. Docks would sit just a little higher out of the water, and boats would tilt against their ropes. When I returned home, I felt something I hadn't in weeks control. For the first time since the bridge fell, I wasn't reacting to them. They would be reacting to me. Sure enough, 2 days later, I saw workers at the resort scrambling to adjust the docks. A few boats were already stuck in shallow mud near the shore. From across the lake, I could hear the buzz of arguments. Karen herself stood at the edge, hands on her hips, yelling into her phone. I smiled to myself. Just a little taste. But it didn't take long for the HOA to come knocking. Literally. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I heard a sharp knock at my front door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, her blazer crisp as ever, a stack of papers in her hand. 2 men from the board flanked her, both wearing expressions that screamed intimidation. "You're interfering with community resources," she said, pushing the papers toward me. "We've noticed unusual changes in the lake levels. If you've tampered with anything," I cut her off. "The lake isn't yours to control. Never has been." She raised her chin. "It affects our residents. That makes it our concern. If this continues, we'll take legal action." I stepped forward, closing the gap between us until she had to tilt her head back to look at me. "You tore down my bridge without asking, without permission. Don't come to me about what's legal." Her lips curled into a smile, but it was thin, tight, forced. "This won't end well for you." Then she turned on her heel and left, her board members following like shadows. I watched them walk away, my pulse racing. She wanted me scared, cornered, doubting myself, but all she did was give me more fuel. That night I drove back to the dam. The key was warm in my pocket, almost like it had been waiting for me. I unlocked the gate again, this time pulling the lever a little farther. The roar grew louder, water gushing out with real force now. I stood there in the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting across the swirling water below, and I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was fighting back. The next morning the lake had dropped noticeably. Whole sections of shoreline were exposed, muddy and cracked. The new boardwalk under construction sat lopsided, its supports sinking into the soft ground. Boats leaned heavily to one side, and the luxury dining expansion looked like a bad joke. From my porch, I could see people gathered at the resort, shouting, pointing, panicking. And in the center of it all was Karen, her perfect posture finally broken as she barked orders at workers who clearly didn't know what to do. For the first time in a long time, I laughed. Not out of humor, but out of something deeper. Justice. But even as I laughed, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA wouldn't take this lying down. They'd come at me harder, with lawyers, with threats, maybe even with police. I'd have to be ready. But for the first time since they started their war, I felt like I had the upper hand. That night, I sat by the fire in my living room, the blueprint spread out on the table beside me. I traced the lines again, studying the dam, the gates, the flow of water downstream. My grandfather had built this as a safeguard, a way to protect the land, and now, decades later, it had become my weapon. I leaned back in my chair, staring into the flames, and whispered to myself, "You destroyed my bridge, I'll destroy your lake." The decision was no longer a question, it was only a matter of time. The days after my second release from the dam were chaos. The lake was dropping fast, more than the HOA could hide from their residents. Boats that once floated gracefully in the water now tilted sideways, half buried in mud. The brand new boardwalk groaned against the soft earth beneath it, tilting dangerously, and the jewel of their expansion, the luxury Lakeside dining project, looked like a house of cards sinking into muck. Every morning I woke up to the sound of shouting across the lake. From my porch I could see HOA board members pacing along the shore, phones pressed to their ears, voices raised. Karen was there every single day, her sharp red blazer now smeared with mud, her hair tied back instead of perfectly styled. The sight alone almost made the sleepless nights worth it, but their desperation came with new attacks. One morning, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway. The deputy stepped out, tall and broad, with his hand resting lightly on his belt. He didn't come up angry, though he came cautious, as though he already knew how messy things were. "You the owner here?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He looked down at a clipboard. "We've received complaints from the HOA that you're tampering with water levels. They claim you're endangering community property." I felt my jaw tighten. "This lake belongs to me. The dam belongs to me. I'm not tampering, I'm exercising my rights." The deputy studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "I'm not here to arrest you. There's no clear statute on this, and frankly it sounds more like a civil dispute. But I'll tell you this, they're not going to stop. They've got money, lawyers, and people in their pockets. You'd better be prepared." "I am," I said simply. He gave me a nod, almost respectful, and drove off that night. I sat by the dam again, staring at the rushing water. The blueprint lay folded in my jacket pocket, but I didn't need it anymore. I knew every line of it by heart. The gates could still go further wide open, and once they did, the lake wouldn't just dip, it would drain. But a small part of me hesitated. Once I pulled that lever all the way, there was no turning back. It wouldn't just inconvenience them. It would destroy everything they had built there: docks, their boats, their resort, their investment. I thought of the families who weren't on the board, the ones who had just bought into the dream Karen sold them. They would suffer too. Then I thought of my bridge, the way it splintered into pieces, the way Karen laughed when I shouted across the water, the way she called it progress. That memory burned away every hesitation. The following morning was crisp and clear. Mist rose off the surface of the shrinking lake, curling like smoke in the dawn light. I walked to the dam with steady steps, my boots crunching over the gravel. My hands didn't shake anymore. My heart didn't pound out of control. I was calm, steady, and focused. When I reached the gate, I pulled out the key and slid it into the lock. The metal clicked open with ease. I gripped the lever with both hands, took a deep breath, and pulled. The sound was deafening. Water roared through the gates with a force that shook the ground beneath my feet. The dam shuddered as gallons upon gallons of water surged downstream, tearing through the spillway in a white, foaming torrent. I could feel the power of it in my chest, like thunder that wouldn't stop. I stood there for a long time, gripping the railing, watching the lake empty itself. The water level dropped, inch by inch, then foot by foot, the shoreline retreating so quickly it looked unnatural. What had taken decades to fill was vanishing in hours. By the time I walked back to my house, the chaos had already begun. From my porch I could see the resort in full panic. Workers ran back and forth trying to secure boats that were already stuck in mud. The brand new boardwalk tilted so far that people were climbing onto it to try and brace it with ropes. Karen shouted into a megaphone, her voice cutting across the water, but it was no use. The lake was leaving them. Residents gathered in clusters, their expensive summer clothes now smeared with dirt as they tried to push stranded boats back into the shrinking water. Children cried, parents yelled, and everywhere I looked was panic. The perfect picture of lakeside luxury was unraveling before my eyes, and still the water drained. By nightfall, entire sections of the lakebed were exposed. Fish flopped helplessly in the mud. Docks that once stretched into the water now stood in open air, wooden skeletons pointing into nothing. The resort lights reflected off puddles instead of waves. Their million-dollar view was gone. Karen stormed across the property line that evening, mud caked on her shoes, her face red with rage. She didn't bother knocking this time. She shouted my name from the yard until I stepped outside. "You did this," she screamed, pointing toward the lake. "You destroyed everything." I stood on my porch, arms crossed, calm in the face of her fury. "You destroyed my bridge," I said evenly. "I just returned the favor." Her voice cracked with rage. "We'll sue you into the ground. We'll take everything you own." I shook my head slowly. "Good luck with that. The dam was built by my grandfather. The lake is on my property. I've got every deed and document to prove it. You should have thought about that before you tried to push me off my land." The first time, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. Just for a moment, her mask slipped. She realized this wasn't a battle she could win with letters and fines. This was something she couldn't control. She spat into the dirt and stormed away, muttering curses as she went. That night I walked back to the dam. The roar had lessened, the flow slowing as the lake's level dropped lower and lower. I stood there in the silence, the air thick with the smell of wet earth, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. They couldn't take this from me anymore. Not the lake, not the land, not my family's legacy. The resort across the way would never recover. Their $2 million paradise had been reduced to a swamp overnight. The families who bought into Karen's promises would leave their investments worthless. The HOA itself would crumble under lawsuits from its own residents. And all because they thought they could break me by breaking a bridge. But bridges can be rebuilt. Lakeside resorts built on arrogance, those don't come back. As I stood there, the stars reflecting faintly in the last pools of water, I whispered a quiet promise to my grandfather. They'll never touch this land again, not while I'm here. And with that, I finally felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The war wasn't over yet, not with Karen's pride still burning, but the battlefield was mine now. The morning sun cast long golden streaks over the bare lakebed, drying cracks into the earth where fish once swam freely. The boats that had once dotted the water sat awkwardly in the mud, leaning like defeated soldiers after battle. It was a strange, quiet sight. For years, the lake had been the HOA's pride, their selling point, their treasure. On now it was nothing more than an empty bowl of dirt and broken promises. Word had spread quickly. News stations from nearby towns came to film what they were calling the Vanishing Lake Scandal. Reporters with microphones crowded the dried shore, eager to capture sound bites from angry homeowners who had invested millions in waterfront property that no longer had water. Some shouted at me across the cracked mud, others tried to block the cameras, embarrassed by the humiliation of losing the very thing they paid so much for. I stood tall on the bank, my boots covered in dust. It wasn't pride I felt, not exactly, it was justice. For years, the HOA had bullied me, dismissed me, and tried to erase my family's history. They thought tearing down my bridge would force me to bend, to sell, to surrender. But instead, it led to this moment, where their arrogance drained away with the water. Karen, the HOA president, was red in the face as she raged in front of the cameras. She blamed me, called me a criminal, and demanded that law enforcement arrest me on the spot. But standing only a few feet away were deputies from the county sheriff's office, and not one of them moved to cuff me. Why? Because they all knew the truth. The dam, the water, the land, it was all legally mine. My family had built it, maintained it, and paid taxes on it for decades. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was exercising my rights. The reporters turned their cameras from her ranting to my silence. They seemed to realize that this wasn't just about water or land. It was the story of a man standing up against a machine that thought it could trample anyone in its way, and people loved that kind of story. By noon, the HOA held an emergency meeting in the community center. They tried to close the doors to keep me out, but state law required that meetings affecting all landowners be open. I walked in, boots echoing on their polished floor, and the room went silent. Dozens of faces turned toward me, filled with anger, shame, or fear. Karen, sitting at the head of the table, glared at me as if her hatred alone could burn me down. "This man," she said, pointing a sharp finger in my direction, "has destroyed everything we built. He must restore the lake immediately." Her words were met with a mix of cheers and shouts. Some homeowners backed her rage, but others were more cautious. A few even asked her the question she had avoided for months. Why did she order my bridge torn down in the first place? The moment that question hit the air, the tide shifted. I leaned against the wall and finally spoke. "You wanted control of my land. You thought you could bully me into selling by cutting me off. You called it progress. I call it theft. And now you're seeing the cost of your greed." Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded at my words. Some scowled. But the seed of doubt had been planted. For years, Karen had run the HOA with fear, using fines and threats to silence anyone who disagreed. Now, for the first time, they were questioning her authority. The meeting devolved into chaos, homeowners arguing among themselves, demanding answers. I quietly slipped out, knowing my point had been made without needing to fight further. The cracks in the HOA's power were wider than the cracks in the lakebed. Over the following weeks, the HOA tried everything to force me into compliance. They filed lawsuits claiming the drained lake had caused property values to plummet. They begged county officials to intervene, but each time the answer was the same. The land and water rights were mine, and I was within my rights to manage them however I saw fit. Every lawyer they hired eventually told them the same truth. Some homeowners eventually packed up and left, unable to bear the sight of their dream homes now overlooking dry dirt. Others stayed but grew bitter, their fury turning against the very HOA they had once trusted to protect them. Meanwhile, I rebuilt. The bridge that had been destroyed was replaced, stronger and sturdier than ever, built with my own hands and local woodworkers who respected what it stood for. I added benches along its edge, just like my grandfather once had, so children could sit and dangle their legs over the water, or what would eventually be water again. Yes, eventually, because I never intended to leave the lake dry forever. That wasn't justice, that would have been cruelty. Once the bridge was complete, I made the choice to slowly close the dam's gates again, allowing the waters to rise inch by inch, reclaiming the basin. But this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me, for my family, and for the generations who would come after. The HOA no longer had control over the lake. They couldn't hold it over me, couldn't use it as a weapon. It was mine, as it always should have been, and if they wanted to enjoy it, they would have to respect me and the land that gave it to them. The day the water finally reached the base of my new bridge, I stood there with a fishing pole, just as my father once had, casting a line into the rippling surface. For the first time in years, I felt peace. The war was over, and I had won without firing a shot. Karen, on the other hand, didn't recover. Her reputation was shattered, her power gone. At the next HOA election, she was voted out in disgrace, replaced by a quieter, humbler board that no longer dared to challenge me. In the end, the lake had broken her, not me. Looking back, I realized something important. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. They had taken something sacred from me, believing money and power gave them the right. But when I drained that lake, I reminded the whole world that true power lies in roots, history, and the strength to stand your ground. And as I sat on my bridge, watching the sun set over the rising lake, I whispered to myself, some battles aren't fought with fists or guns. They're fought with patience, persistence, and the courage to turn the tide. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube. Your support helps us bring more powerful real-life inspired stories to you.